want you to picture something. Two women walk into a manager's office. They don't knock, or if they do, they don't wait for an answer. They just walk in and they drop a stack of papers on the desk in front of him. They look him in the eye and they say, This is what your decision cost us. The papers are price sheets. They're estimates, line items representing every dollar, every hour the organization had invested in onboarding, training, mentoring, and developing a new employee. An employee that David, their manager, had personally selected over the recommendation. An employee who had accepted a job offer at a more prestigious firm and had given his 2 weeks' notice. The women were not wrong. The numbers were real. The money was gone. And David, who had spent years watching his subordinates make what he believed were suboptimal hiring decisions, had just watched his own judgment produce exactly the outcome that they had been trying to prevent with their unofficial policy that they had imposed themselves. Now, before I tell you what David decided to do next, I want you to sit with that for a moment and just think, because I think most leaders, if they're honest, understand the logic of that conversation. The organization invested time, they invested money. The employee took what was offered, built his repertoire, and then he left. The cost was documented, and someone had to be accountable for that decision, and that decision had been David's. What David decided to do next is one of the most quietly devastating things that I've ever encountered in my work with organizations. And the reason it's devastating is not because it was irrational, because it made sense, complete sense in the short term, in the narrow frame, in the specific context of that moment with those price sheets on that desk. And what it eventually produced was an organization that had been deliberately engineered to stay silent, not by accident, by policy. I'm Dr. Ashley Newcomb, founder of Inspired Coaching and Leadership, and this is the Resilient Organization. And today we're going to talk about the hidden cost of a quiet organization, what it actually costs, where those costs hide, and what happens when an organization stops trying to prevent them and starts trying to profit from them instead. Let me give you some background on David before we go further, because context really does matter here, and I don't want you to arrive at a judgment before you have the full picture. David was a senior leader overseeing hiring in his organization. He had the authority to make the final decisions on candidates, but he had delegated the actual interviewing and selection process to two of his subordinates, Cheryl and Diane, as a part of their regular responsibilities. It was a reasonable delegation. They were experienced, they knew the work, they knew what the roles required, and to be honest, he did it to give them a leg up in their professional career. And yet David noticed over time that Cheryl and Diane were consistently not selecting the highest ranked candidates, not the top scorer, not the second scorer. They were selecting people who were, in David's own personal assessment, were either at or below par. They were capable enough to do the job, but not the strongest candidates that were available to the selection crew. When he asked them about it, their answer stopped him cold, and he felt like their answer was ultimately not in the best interest of the organization. You see, they told him that they had stopped selecting the highest scoring candidates because those candidates always left. Roughly about 6 months in, long enough to gain the experience and the credentials of having worked for the organization, long enough to put it on their resume and leverage it for something better. They would accept a more attractive offer elsewhere after fully taking advantage of what this organization offered them by means of training and experience. They would accept offers that had higher salaries, more prestigious firms, better opportunities, and the organization was left holding the investment it had made in someone who was always, in retrospect, just passing through. So Cheryl and Diane developed a different strategy. They selected candidates who were competent but not exceptional, people who were, in their honest assessment, were unlikely to receive competing offers at more competitive organizations. As David put it in our conversation, these were people who had an innate sense of helplessness, who felt grateful for the opportunity rather than strategically positioned to use it as a stepping stone. David thought that the ladies were wrong. He sat in on the next round of interviews and overruled their recommendation. He selected, instead of number 3 or 4 on the list, number 1, the top scoring candidate. So the candidate that he selected went through months of training. He received mentoring, he consumed the organization's time and resources, and 6 months later, he promptly accepted a more advantageous offer elsewhere. That, my friends, is when Cheryl and Diane marched into his office with the price sheets. And here's what David told me he sat with after that meeting. He couldn't argue with the numbers. He couldn't argue with the pattern. Cheryl and Diane, as much as he hated to admit it, had identified something real that the organization had become for high performers. The organization had become a resume-building stop on their way to someplace better. And his instinct to override that conclusion had cost the organization money that he couldn't argue wasn't real. So David made a decision. He gave Cheryl and Diane authority to set the hiring policy. And the policy they set was this: hire candidates with limited outside options. Hire people who feel fortunate to be here. Hire people who are unlikely to leave. Not because they love it here, but because they don't think that they can do any better. In other words, deliberately hire people who are already experiencing the early stages of organizational learned helplessness or organizational Cinderella syndrome before they even walk through the door. I want to pause here and be very honest with you about something. I'm not going to tell you that David was a monster. He was not. He was a pragmatic leader who had been presented with a documented financial problem and a demonstrated pattern that had just been confirmed. And the solution that Diane and Cheryl proposed, while deeply troubling, was built on real data. But I also want to be very clear about what this decision set in motion, because the cost of what David built is orders of magnitude larger than the cost of the onboarding dollars he was trying to protect. And that cost, the real cost, is what this episode is actually about. So I do want to kind of stick a side note in here and remind you that the whole purpose of this podcast is to discuss how to build resilient organizations and the challenges that come at resilient organizations and attack them. So with that said, I want to name something explicitly here, and I want to name it using the language that we've been developing this whole season. Because once you see it through that lens, I think the full weight of David's policy and what David's policy produced becomes impossible to miss. What David authorized was the deliberate recruitment of organizational learned helplessness and organizational Cinderella syndrome. And we've already established that those are two of the biggest threats to resiliency in an organization. In episodes 4 and 5, we talked about OLH and organizational Cinderella syndrome as patterns that develop inside followers when the conditions around them consistently fail to reward their effort or agency. They're painful patterns, they're costly patterns, but they develop over time through experience, through repeated signals from the environment that trying just doesn't produce results. What David's organization did was different. They went to the source. They didn't wait for high performers to become helpless. They selected for helplessness at the point of hire. They intentionally looked for people that already struggled with hopelessness. They built a workforce that arrived already conditioned to believe that the organization in front of them was the best that they could do. That gratitude, not contribution, was the appropriate emotional response to employment. That leaving for something better was not a real option. And here's the first hidden cost, the one that never showed up on Cheryl or Diane's price sheets. When you hire helplessness or hopelessness, you hire against innovation. You hire against initiative. You hire against a discretionary effort and the honest feedback and the early warning signals that resilient organizations depend on. You build a workforce that will comply because compliance is safe and they know it, but they will never fully contribute. Because full contribution requires the belief that your contribution matters. And the people that David was hiring had been specifically selected because that belief was already fragile, if not non-existent. That is the first cost, and that compounds every single day. The second cost is what happens to the organizational culture over time. Culture that is built around the management of helpless employees is not a healthy culture. It is a culture of control, of keeping people small, of keeping expectations low, of keeping the power asymmetry intact. And cultures of control are self-reinforcing. The leaders inside them begin to need the control as much as the followers have learned to accept it. Managers who are good at managing dependent followers become poor at developing independent ones. The skills atrophy. And over time, the organization loses the capacity for a different kind of leadership because, unfortunately, the leadership that it has developed is perfectly suited for the workforce that it deliberately built. That, my friends, is the second cost, and it's generational. The third cost, and I think this is really the one that should keep leaders up at night, is what David left behind when he retired. David had a reason for his policy. He understood its origins, he understood what it was solving and what it was sacrificing. He held the full complexity of his decision in his own mind and made a conscious choice. And when he walked out the door, that complexity walked out the door with him. What stayed behind was the policy, the practice, the culture that it had produced, and the people who had grown up inside of that culture, who had learned to exercise power over a workforce that had been selected for its limited options, without David's original pragmatic rationale to constrain them. Because here's what happens when you deliberately build a system of exploitation, even a rational one, even one built on real financial data, and then leave. The system doesn't stay rational. It gets weaponized. It gets weaponized against the workforce. The people who inherit it don't inherit the context. They inherit the mechanism. And without the original reasoning to anchor it, a mechanism for controlling people who believe they have no other options becomes something much darker than David ever intended. Systems outlive the people who build them. And the architecture of exploitation, once it's constructed, it unfortunately does not stay contained. That organization, after David's retirement, became a genuinely toxic environment, an inherently toxic environment, an inherited toxic environment. Not because David was malicious, but because he built something that had toxicity baked into its very DNA. And once he was gone, there was nothing, no one there to stop that toxicity from being fully expressed by people with the power, but no context, no history, and what came across is no empathy for the followers within the organization. Okay. So I want to spend a little time right here on the concrete cost of organizational silence, because I think that one of the reasons leaders don't act on this with sufficient urgency is that the costs are genuinely hard to see on a spreadsheet. They don't show up as a line item. They don't appear in a quarterly report. They accumulate quietly in categories that don't have obvious dollar signs attached to them until they become a crisis, at which point they are usually far more expensive to address than they would have been to prevent. The first category is talent cost, and David's story illustrates this better than almost any example that I could have constructed. When your organization is not at a place where high performers choose to stay, whether it's because they're resume building or because it's a culture that exploits rather than develops, you are in a permanent cycle of recruiting, onboarding, and losing talent. The financial cost of that cycle is significant and well documented. The less visible cost is institutional knowledge that leaves with every departure. The relationships, the context, the understanding of how things actually work, that walks out the door too. And that's a loss that compounds in ways that never appear on a price sheet. The second category is innovation cost. Organizations that have gone quiet, where give up silence or cover your back silence or protective silence has taken hold, or where the workforce has been deliberately hired for compliance rather than contribution, do not innovate. They execute, and execution without innovation is a competitive liability that grows more serious with every passing year. The ideas that would normally arise just organically that would have improved the product, the process, or the customer experience, the competitive positioning, those ideas either don't exist in a silent organization or they've existed, but they are never surfaced. Either way, the organization doesn't benefit from them, and the market eventually notices. The third category is resilience cost, and this is the one that David's organization paid the most dearly. A workforce that has been selected for helplessness or hopelessness or conditioned into it, or simply allowed to drift there through years of unresponsive leadership, is a workforce that cannot adapt under pressure. When disruption hits, and trust me, it always hits, the organization reaches for the capacity, the initiative, the creative problem solving that resilience requires, and it isn't there because it was never cultivated. It was never welcomed. Because somewhere along the way, the message was sent through policy or through culture or through hiring practice or through all three that it wasn't needed. And the fourth category is the human cost. And I want to discuss this one last, not because it's least important, but because I think it deserves to be the final word on what silence costs. The people inside the quiet organization, the ones who were hired for their limited options, or who learned through experience that their voice doesn't matter, or who are quietly covering their backs or giving up or staying silent to protect someone that they care about. Those are human beings with families and ambitions and the capacity for genuine contribution. And the slow, quiet cost of being in an environment that keeps them small is one that doesn't show up anywhere in organizational accounting. But it's real and it's significant, and it doesn't stay at work when they go home. The most expensive things in your organization are the ones that don't appear on a balance sheet. Now I want to give Cheryl and Diane a moment because I think that they deserve it. It would be easy, but it would be wrong, to frame them as the architects of something sinister. They just weren't. It's just not that simple. They were two mid-level managers who identified a real pattern, a real financial problem, and a real organizational failure. That high performers were using their organization as credentials and then leaving. And they solved it with a tool that they had access to. And to be honest, in the moment and with everything that they had in front of them, all the data, all the variables, they thought that they were doing what was best for the organization. Were there other solutions? Almost certainly. Were there ways to address the high performer retention problem that didn't involve deliberately selecting for limited options? Probably, but those solutions would have required resources, strategy, and organizational investment that Cheryl and Diane didn't have the authority to authorize and may not have even known existed. What they had authority over was the candidate selection, and that's what they used. The harder question is, and this is the one that I really want you to ponder, is not whether or not Cheryl and Diane made the right call. The question is, what kind of organization produces a situation where those are the only tools available to address a very real problem? Because David's organization had a retention problem long before it had a hiring problem. And the retention problem, why high performers were leaving after 6 months, what the organization was or wasn't offering that made staying unattractive, was the problem that never got addressed. Instead, the organization adapted to it in a way that made underlying problems permanently invisible. This is what organizational silence does at scale. It doesn't just suppress voices, it redirects the energy that would have surfaced and solved problems into workarounds that make those problems easier to live with. And workarounds, as David's story shows, has a way of becoming the new normal long after anyone remembers what they were working around or why they were working around it. So here are 3 questions for your hiring process. Now, these 3 quick fixes in this episode are different from the others in this season because the lesson of David's story is the most actionable at the point of hire, before the damage is done. So instead of 3 things to do this week, I want to offer 3 questions that every leader should be asking about their hiring process. First, why do your best people leave? And have you actually answered that question? David's organization had a retention problem that they addressed by changing who they hired rather than why people were leaving. This is a very expensive way to avoid a very important conversation. If your organization has a pattern of high performers leaving within a year, the question worth asking is not how do we hire people who won't leave, it's what is this organization offering that makes staying so unattractive to someone with options? The answer to that question is almost always more actionable and more honest than the alternative. Second, are you hiring for contribution or compliance. This is not always a conscious choice, but it is always a choice. Look at your last several hires. Look at who got selected and who didn't, and ask yourself honestly, are we selecting for people who will challenge us in a positive and healthy way, who will bring things forward, who will grow beyond this role, or are we selecting people who will stay in their lane, not cause friction, and feel fortunate to be here? Neither answer is neutral. Both produce a culture, and the culture that your hiring decisions produce is the culture that your organization will have to live inside of. Third, what does your organization do with the people that it develops? Because David's retention problem was not a hiring problem. It was a development problem. His organization was excellent at onboarding and training, excellent enough that high performers leveraged it to get hired someplace that they perceived as better. The question that never got asked, that probably should have been number one on the list of questions to ask, is what would it take to be the place where they wanted to stay? What would it mean to build an organization where development leads to growth opportunity rather than departure? That question is harder than changing a hiring policy, but it's the only question that addresses the actual problem. And any organizational consultant worth their salt will tell you one of the most challenging things about working with a client is getting them to understand the difference between a symptom of the problem and the actual problem. So your organization may not have a hiring policy designed to select for helplessness or hopelessness. I genuinely hope it doesn't. But if you've been listening to this season, I'd invite you to ask yourself honestly whether the outcome of your current culture, whatever it produced, however it got there, looks anything like the one that David built. Now, a small disclaimer was that David didn't actually build this culture, he inherited it. But what he did and what his subordinates did, who one of them actually retired before he did, one of them retired after he did, they didn't intend to grow this culture or to make it worse. It just happened through acts of genuine benevolence, trying to do what's best for the organization. Ask yourself whether the people in your organization feel genuinely free to contribute, to challenge, to grow, to speak, or whether something, a policy, a culture, a history of unaddressed patterns has quietly produced a workforce that stays not because they're invested, but because they believe that they don't have any better options. Because the cost of that in talent and innovation and resilience and the humanity of people inside of your organization, that's real. It's significant. And unlike the price sheets that Cheryl and Diane put on David's desk, most of it will never be documented. It'll just quietly shape the trajectory of your organization until the day something forces it into the light. If you want to understand what's actually happening inside of your organization before that day comes, that's exactly the work I do. You can reach me at inspiredcoaching.net. I'd like to have that conversation with you. So as I mentioned, David retired, Diane and Cheryl retired, but the policy stayed. And the organization that inherited it didn't inherit David's reasoning, just the mechanism. So what started as a pragmatic response to a documented financial problem became a system that no one really understood because the system had outlived its original architects. In our next episode, we're going to shift the lens one more time and ask a question that I think changes everything. Can you actually diagnose what's happening in your organization? Do you have the tools, the language, and the honest internal culture to see what's really there? That's episode 10, and that's where we begin to move from understanding the problem to building the path out of it. The training When Followers Go Quiet, Diagnosing Your Hidden Disengagement in Your Organization, and other free resources are available at inspiredcoaching.net. And if today's episode raises some questions that feel bigger than the download, reach out. That's what I'm here for. This has been The Resilient Organization. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you next time.